The story opens in the suffocating silence of a prestigious classroom, establishing a sharp contrast between vulnerable endurance and restrained, absolute power. We see Hae-in, softly lit and fragile, hunched over her work while a looming predatory silence emanates from her desk mate, Ji-hoon. While the classroom is filled with the chaotic noise of bullies, Ji-hoon remains intimidatingly calm, his eyes obscured by shadows behind his glasses as he performs the simple act of picking up Hae-in's dropped pen. This quiet moment is shattered by a subtle clue of his true status. A high-end burner phone in his pocket vibrates with a call from the clan vanguard, which he ignores to remain by Hae-in's side. The classroom was a cold, monochrome landscape of blue-gray tones, where the air felt heavy with a quiet, atmospheric menace. Hae-in sat at her desk, a small island of soft light amidst the gloom, her head bowed in a posture of practiced vulnerability. She focused intensely on her notebook, her pen moving in frantic, silent strokes as if the ink could build a wall between her and the surrounding malice of the elite royals who ruled the hallways. Every sharp laugh from the back of the room and every whispered taunt felt like a physical weight, yet she remained perfectly still, a living ghost anchored only by the wood of her desk. Beside her, Ji-hoon sat in a silence so deep it felt predatory. He was the ultimate shadow, his presence radiating a restrained power that none of their classmates truly understood. Behind the glare of his glasses, his eyes were lost in shadow, and his silver hair caught the dim light like cold steel. To the rest of the school, he was merely the harmless, obedient desk mate, an ordinary student who never raised his voice. He wore his dark, authoritative clothing beneath his school blazer like a hidden suit of armor, his sharp facial definition marking him as something far more dangerous than the nerd he pretended to be. They did not speak, yet a silent bond pulled tight between them in the stillness. It was a connection forged in the calm before the punishment, a shared language of heavy breaths and unmoving gazes. When Hae-in's hand trembled, Ji-hoon's knuckles would whiten against the table. When a bully's shadow loomed too close, the air around Ji-hoon would grow fractionally colder, a warning felt but never seen. A pen slipped from Hae-in's fingers, clattering against the floor and echoing like a gunshot in the hushed room. Before she could reach for it, Ji-hoon moved. His motion was fluid, cinematic, and entirely devoid of the clumsiness expected of his persona. As he leaned down to retrieve the pen, the high-end burner phone tucked in his pocket vibrated with a rhythmic, urgent hum. The screen flickered with a single, glowing notification: Clan Vanguard. He didn't look at the device. He didn't acknowledge the invisible world of black luxury cars idling at the gate or the high-level calls for the Baek clan heir. His focus remained entirely on the girl beside him. He placed the pen back on her desk with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second near hers. Hae-in didn't look up, but her breathing hitched, a small, ragged break in her facade that only he was allowed to hear. In that moment, the hierarchy of the school felt like a fragile glass house, waiting for the night to fall so the king could finally break it. The classroom was a chamber of cold, blue-gray tones, the air heavy with the quiet menace of a storm that had not yet broken. Hae-in sat in her usual pool of soft, dim light, her head bowed over her notebook in a posture of practiced vulnerability. Beside her, Ji-hoon was a shadow of restrained power, his silver hair catching the dull light while his eyes remained obscured behind the dark glare of his glasses. He didn't speak. He simply existed in a predatory silence that seemed to swallow the chaotic whispers of the room. The silence was shattered when the royals sashayed toward their desk, their laughter jagged and sharp against the cinematic stillness Ji-hoon maintained. The leader of the group, a girl whose father's company was currently unknowingly being audited by Ji-hoon's subordinates, sneered as she held a heavy bottle of permanent ink. With a flick of her wrist, she doused Hae-in's notebook. The black liquid splattered across the white pages like a dark omen, staining Hae-in's hands and the hem of her uniform. Hae-in flinched, her hand trembling as she tried to wipe the ink away, her focus remaining intensely on the wreckage of her work despite the surrounding malice. She didn't look up. She had learned that endurance was her only shield. But the bullying didn't stop at ink. As Hae-in reached for a cloth, the girl shoved her, the force sending Hae-in's wrist cracking against the hard edge of the desk. A sharp gasp escaped Hae-in, lips as a fresh bruise began to bloom against her pale skin. Ji-hoon's hand, which had been resting idly near his own notebook, suddenly stilled. The shadows across his eyes deepened, and for a split second, the authoritative black clothing beneath his school blazer seemed to pulse with a lethal intent. In the window behind them, the reflection of the black luxury cars idling at the gate seemed to grow more prominent, the clan vanguard, waiting for a signal that was only heartbeats away. He didn't stand. He didn't shout. Instead, Ji-hoon leaned down and picked up the pen Hae-in had dropped in the scuffle. As he handed it back, his fingers brushed against her ink-stained skin. The touch was light, but his gaze, sharp and defined behind his lenses, finally lifted to the bullies. It was a look of absolute, icy reckoning, the calm before a total nightfall. To the class, he was still the harmless desk mate, but as the burner phone in his pocket vibrated with another urgent alert, the message was clear. The audit was over. The punishment was beginning. The cold, damp air of the basement felt like a physical weight against Hae-in's chest, the silence broken only by the muffled, rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps on the floorboards above. She sat on a rusted folding chair, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of her notebook in the dim, flickering light. Upstairs, the life she knew was being dismantled in a series of sharp, transactional whispers. "The total is 10 million, her stepfather's voice drifted down, stripped of its usual blustering bravado and replaced by a desperate, jagged edge. "The interest alone is burying us. If we don't settle tonight, they'll take the house, the cars, everything." Hae-in closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool stone wall. She could almost picture the scene in the parlor, her stepfather packing the Persian rug, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson, while her stepmother watched him with eyes like cold chips of flint. They weren't discussing a loan or a second mortgage. They were discussing her. "We have one asset left," her stepmother murmured, her voice as smooth and lethal as a silk garrote. "Chairman Kang has been asking about her for months. He doesn't care about the family's bankruptcy. He wants a clean addition to his household. One night, one signature, and the debt is erased." The realization hit Hae-in with the force of a kinetic strike. She wasn't a daughter to them, or even a burden. She was a blood bag, a final currency to be traded in the shadows of the Manhattan streets. The business dinner they had scheduled for tonight was nothing more than a slave auction, and she was the primary lot. A heavy bolt slid back at the top of the stairs, and a sliver of harsh, amber light cut through the gloom. Her stepfather stood in the doorway, his silhouette a dark, authoritative tear against the glow. He didn't look at the bruise on her wrist or the exhaustion etched into her face. He only saw a way out. "Get up," he commanded, his voice a flat, lethal rasp. "The stylist is here. You need to look perfect for the chairman. Don't make me regret keeping you this long." As she was led up into the light, Hae-in felt a cold, jagged spike of justice at any cost beginning to stir beneath her fear. She thought of Ji-hoon, sitting at his desk with that intimidating, predatory silence, and wondered if he could see the invisible cage closing around her. She didn't know that miles away, in a rain-slicked alleyway, a high-end burner phone was already vibrating with the order to begin the audit. The Shen family was preparing for a sale, but they were entirely unaware that the lowly help was about to kick the chair out from under all of them. The classroom was a cold, blue-gray vacuum of tension as Hae-in kept her head bowed over her notebook, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped her pen. Beside her, Ji-hoon sat in his dark, authoritative clothing, a silent and intimidatingly calm presence that seemed to absorb the ambient malice of the room. Outside the window, the blurred silhouettes of black luxury sedans remained parked in the shadows, a quiet testament to the Baek King sitting just inches away from the ink-stained desk. The morning silence was fractured not by a shout, but by the frantic vibration of a phone. At the front of the room, Choi Min-ho, the boy whose laughter had been the loudest when he doused Hae-in's desk in ink, fumbled with his device. His face, usually twisted in a mask of arrogant superiority, drained of all color in a matter of seconds. Ji-hoon did not look up. He remained focused on the simple task of straightening a stray paper on Hae-in's desk, his movements slow and deliberate. His silver hair caught the dim light, casting a sharper shadow across his eyes behind the glasses. He was the picture of a harmless nerd, even as a high-end burner phone in his own pocket buzzed with a silent confirmation from the clan vanguard. "No," Minho whispered, his voice cracking. "That's impossible." He bolted from the room, the door slamming behind him. The royals exchanged confused glances, their predatory noise momentarily silenced by the sudden exit of their leader. They didn't know that miles away, a board of directors had just voted to liquidate Minho's father's firm, a multi-million-dollar empire dismantled in a single hour of the audit. The order hadn't come from a rival corporation, but from a shadow that sat at the back of a high school classroom. Hae-in finally looked up, her gaze drifting toward the window where the black cars idled. She felt the weight of Ji-hoon's gaze, a heavy, predatory silence that felt strangely like a shield. She didn't see the dark reflection in his glasses. She only saw the desk mate who had quietly picked up her dropped pen. Ji-hoon reached out, his hand steady as he adjusted the corner of her notebook. He didn't need to throw a single punch to destroy a life. He only needed to decide that the pillar of Minho's world was no longer allowed to stand. To the rest of the school, it was a mysterious stroke of bad luck. To Ji-hoon, it was merely the first shadow of the Nightfall reckoning. The cafeteria was a battlefield of social hierarchy, but the corner where Hae-in sat remained a quiet, isolated island of blue-gray tones. She kept her head bowed over a meager, dry sandwich, her shoulders hunched as she tried to make herself invisible to the royals, laughing across the room. The vulnerability in her posture was palpable, a soft light catching the stray hairs falling across her face as she focused on her work to avoid eye contact. Without a word, a shadow fell over her table. Ji-hoon slid into the seat across from her, his presence bringing a sudden, heavy silence that seemed to push back the chaotic noise of the bullies. He looked intimidatingly calm, the sharp definition of his jawline highlighted by the dim indoor lighting, while his eyes remained unreadable behind the glare of his glasses. He didn't carry a plastic tray like the other students. Instead, he placed a discreet, black lacquered box on the table. "You aren't eating enough," he murmured, his voice a low, authoritative rasp that felt out of place in a high school lunchroom. He opened the box, revealing a spread that hinted at a level of wealth far beyond an ordinary student. Delicate, hand-pressed sushi, wagyu beef slices, and seasonal fruits that looked like polished gems. The contrast between his expensive dark clothing and the simple school environment was sharper than ever, a quiet menace radiating from his stillness. Hae-in looked up, her hand instinctively twitching to cover a faint bruise on her wrist. I can't take this, Ji-hoon. It looks too expensive." Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He picked up a pair of silver-tipped chopsticks and placed a piece of the wagyu on her plate with practiced, predatory precision. Through the window behind him, the blurred silhouettes of 3 black luxury cars remained idling at the curb, their headlights flickering once as if acknowledging a king. "It's just food, Hae-in," he said, his focus entirely on her, ignoring the high-end burner phone that vibrated silently in his blazer pocket. "Eat! You'll need your strength for what's coming." For a moment, the packing of the room seemed to slow to the rhythm of his heavy, restrained breaths. Hae-in felt a strange, cinematic depth of field narrowing the world down to just the two of them. She believed he was just a kind, observant nerd, never suspecting that the boy sharing his lunch was the same heir who was currently orchestrating the financial collapse of her tormentors' families. As she took a bite, the warmth of the food contrasted with the cold, blue-gray atmosphere of the school, a small, temporary haven provided by a boy who was secretly a predator waiting for nightfall. The neon pulse of the underground club felt like a rhythmic assault against Hae-in's temples, the air thick with the cloying sense of expensive cologne and desperation. She stood in the narrow, dimly lit dressing room, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the fabric of the high-slit dress her stepfather had forced her into. The business dinner he had promised was a lie. Instead, she had been delivered to the back entrance of this velvet-lined cage to work a hostess shift she never agreed to. Every flickering light seemed to expose her vulnerability, a stark contrast to the quiet safety she felt at her school desk. "Smile, Hae-in," her brother's voice hissed from the doorway, his eyes darting toward the heavy curtains where the VIP guests waited. "You're here to charm the creditors, not look like you're going to a funeral. One night of work and the family debt is managed." He didn't see her as a sister. He saw her as a transaction, a blood bag to be drained for his own survival. She stepped out into the main lounge, the floor vibrating beneath her heels. The royals from her school were there, tucked into a corner booth, their laughter sharp and cruel as they recognized the girl they tormented daily. They pointed and whispered, their malice amplified by the shadows of the club. Hae-in lowered her gaze, trying to maintain her obedient mask, but the weight of their attention felt like lead. As she approached the center table with a tray of crystal glasses, a hand suddenly gripped her wrist. It was Chairman Kang, the cruel creditor her family feared most. His grip was cold, his eyes mapping her with a terrifying, proprietary focus. "The Park family finally brought something worth looking at," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the bass. Hae-in froze, her breath hitching in her throat as the room began to spin. In that moment of absolute terror, her eyes drifted toward the dark periphery of the room. Standing near the heavy iron exit doors was a figure that shouldn't have been there. It was Ji-hoon. He wasn't wearing his oversized sweater or his thick glasses. He stood in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the neon light, his silver hair sharp against the gloom. He wasn't moving, but his presence radiated a predatory, Baek King authority that silenced the space around him. For a heartbeat, his gaze met hers, and the harmless nerd was nowhere to be found. Behind him, the blurred forms of several men in dark suits waited for a single command. Hae-in felt a jolt of confusion. He looked like a king, yet he was watching her with a restrained intensity that suggested he was merely waiting for the right moment to burn the entire building down. She didn't know that by nightfall, everyone in this room would be finished. She only knew that the silence of the classroom had followed her into the dark, and the man at her desk was no longer a shadow. He was the storm. The heavy afternoon sun filtered through the classroom windows, casting long, sharp shadows over Hae-in's desk as she worked in her usual focused silence. Beside her, Ji-hoon sat like a dark, immovable monolith, his silver hair catching the light while his eyes remained guarded behind his glasses. The atmosphere was thick with a quiet menace, a cinematic stillness that only they seemed to inhabit amidst the distant, hollow laughter of the royals in the hallway. The peace was fractured when a heavy thud echoed against the classroom door. A man in a sharp, dark suit, part of the new security detail hired by the school's elite families, stepped inside to deliver a message to one of the bullies. He moved with the practiced, aggressive stride of a career enforcer, his eyes scanning the room with bored disdain until they landed on the back corner. The guard's footsteps faltered. His breath hitched, the sound loud in the hushed room. He didn't see a harmless nerd. He saw the sharp facial definition and the authoritative black clothing of a man who ruled the world he occupied. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, turning his face a ghostly, ashen gray. This wasn't a student. It was the sole heir to the Baek clan. The Baek King, whose name was whispered with terror in every rain-slicked alley in the city. "Young," the guard started, his voice cracking as he instinctively began to lower his head in a deep, trembling bow. Ji-hoon didn't look up from his textbook, but the air in the room suddenly turned cold, a predatory silence radiating from him that felt like a blade held to the guard's throat. He reached out with a slow, deliberate motion to pick up Hae-in's dropped pen, his fingers steady. In the reflection of the window, the fleet of black luxury cars waiting at the gate seemed to shimmer, a blurred promise of the violence that followed his command. The guard froze, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized his catastrophic mistake. Ji-hoon's glasses caught the light, obscuring his eyes, but the message was clear. Interfere, and you are finished. The enforcer swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he backed out of the room without another word, tripping over his own feet in his haste to vanish. Hae-in glanced up, her expression vulnerable and unaware of the shadow war occurring inches from her notebook. She looked at Ji-hoon, who simply handed her the pen with a faint, reassuring tilt of his head. To her, he was still the harmless desk mate who sat with her in the blue-gray tones of their shared isolation. She didn't see the dark, authoritative power he held in check, nor did she know that by nightfall, the man who had almost revealed him would be begging for mercy. The classroom was held in a cold, blue-gray stasis, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and the quiet scratch of pens against paper. Hae-in remained hunched over her notebook, her long hair falling like a protective curtain around her face to shield her from the surrounding malice. Beside her, Ji-hoon sat in his customary, intimidatingly calm silence. Behind his glasses, his eyes were lost in shadow, his dark, authoritative presence barely contained beneath the fabric of his school blazer. A sudden, sharp movement from Hae-in caused her sleeve to ride up just an inch. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, but Ji-hoon's gaze was already there. His breath hitched, falling into the slow, heavy rhythm of a predator catching the scent of blood. There, circling her delicate wrist, was a jagged, purple-black bloom, the unmistakable mark of a hand that had squeezed with the intent to crush. It wasn't the clumsy work of a school bully. It was the heavy, calculated grip of her stepfather. The bruise seemed to throb against the soft light of the room, a loud, screaming testament to the business dinner her family was forcing her to prepare for. Ji-hoon did not move, yet the atmosphere around the desk shifted into something predatory and dark. The light reflecting off his glasses obscured his eyes completely, turning them into cold, silver mirrors that reflected only Hae-in's silent endurance. His hand, resting on the desk, tightened until his knuckles were white as bone. Out the window, the blurred silhouettes of black luxury cars waited like loyal hounds in the gray afternoon, a reflection of the absolute power he was currently straining to hold back. Hae-in pulled her sleeve down quickly, her hand trembling as she tucked it back beneath her notebook. She didn't look up, unaware that the harmless desk mate she felt the need to protect had just begun the audit. To her, he was just a quiet boy who shared his food. She had no way of knowing that the moment he saw that mark, the pillars of her stepfather's life began to crumble in the distance. Through the quiet menace of the room, Ji-hoon's burner phone vibrated once in his pocket. The clan vanguard was waiting for a command. He didn't answer. He simply reached out and picked up a stray pen that had rolled away from Hae-in's shaking fingers, his touch light, his focus unwavering. The mask of the harmless student remained, but by nightfall, the man who had left that bruise would realize that some debts are paid in blood. The afternoon sun bled through the classroom windows in long, cold slats of amber, but it offered no warmth to Hae-in as she stared at the fresh, jagged tear in her notebook. The royals had grown bold, their laughter a jagged glass edge that cut through the silence of the after-school study hour. One of them, a boy whose father owned half the district's real estate, leaned over her desk, his shadow swallowing her small, trembling frame. He reached out to snag a lock of her hair, his sneer widening as he prepared a fresh insult for the girl who never fought back. Beside her, Ji-hoon remained a statue of submissive glass and shadow. His head was tilted down, his silver hair shielding his eyes as he appeared to focus on a complex theorem. But as the bully's fingers brushed Hae-in's shoulder, the air in the room didn't just chill, it curdled. Ji-hoon didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He simply reached out and caught the bully's wrist. The movement was so fast it was less a gesture and more a blur of dark, authoritative fabric. The nerd, who usually fumbled with his pens, now held the boy's arm with the crushing, mechanical precision of a hydraulic press. Slowly, Ji-hoon looked up. The light hit his glasses, but instead of the usual glare, there was only a predatory, dark vacuum where his eyes should have been. "You're breathing in her space," Ji-hoon whispered. His voice was a flat, lethal rasp, devoid of the stuttering hesitation he had performed for months. It was the voice of the Baek clan heir, a sound that carried the weight of the black luxury cars idling at the gates. The bully tried to pull away, but his face paled as he realized he was anchored to a force he couldn't comprehend. For those 10 seconds, the classroom wasn't a school. It was a kill box. Ji-hoon's grip tightened just enough to make the boy's knees buckle, his thumb pressing into a nerve cluster with a casual, terrifying familiarity with human anatomy. Hae-in watched, her breath hitching, her eyes wide as she saw the harmless boy beside her transform. The quiet menace she had sensed in the shadows of the room suddenly coalesced into the boy holding her pen. He looked at the bully with a cold, blue-gray intensity that promised a reckoning far worse than a fistfight. Then, just as quickly as it had arrived, the mask slid back into place. Ji-hoon released the wrist and adjusted his glasses, his posture slumping back into the rounded, non-threatening slouch of a top student. The bully scrambled back, tripping over a chair in his haste to escape the sudden, suffocating pressure. But Ji-hoon was already back to his notebook, his hand steady as he picked up a fallen eraser. "Sorry," Ji-hoon murmured, his voice returning to its soft, unassuming tone. "I think you just startled me." He didn't look at Hae-in, but the high-end burner phone in his pocket vibrated once, a silent confirmation from the vanguard that the audit of the bully's family had officially begun. The silence in the room returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, atmospheric weight of a storm that had just shown its first flash of lightning. The air inside the abandoned dockside warehouse was thick with the scent of saltwater, industrial grease, and the cold, metallic tang of fear. Hae-in sat on a splintering wooden chair at the center of a makeshift ring, her wrists bound tightly with zip ties that bit into her skin. Above her, a single oscillating halogen bulb cast a harsh, sickly yellow glow, making the bruises on her arms look like dark ink stains against her pale skin. She kept her head bowed, her hair falling like a curtain to hide the tears she refused to let fall in front of these men. Around the perimeter of the light, the shadows were filled with the heavy breathing of the city's most depraved creditors and her own stepfather, who stood nervously wringing his hands. To them, she wasn't a girl with dreams of a life outside this cage. She was a final payment, a high-value asset to be traded to settle a mountain of gambling debt. "Gentlemen, let's keep this professional," Chairman Kang announced, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls as he stepped into the light. He leaned down, gripping Hae-in, chin with a gloved hand to force her to look at the room of bidders. "The Park family's debt is substantial, but I think we can all agree the collateral is exceptional." Hae-in closed her eyes, trying to transport her mind back to the quiet of the school library, to the scratching of a pen on a notebook, and the steady, calming presence of the boy who sat beside her every day. She wondered if Ji-hoon was at his desk now, unaware that the girl he had shared his lunch with was being auctioned off like a piece of salvaged cargo. She felt a crushing wave of guilt. She had spent so much time trying to protect his nerdish innocence from the school's bullies, yet she couldn't even save herself from the monsters in her own home. The bidding began with a casual cruelty that made Hae-in's stomach churn. Voices barked out numbers from the darkness, each increment a nail in the coffin of her freedom. Her stepfather smiled, a sickening look of relief washing over his face as the price climbed high enough to clear his ledger. He didn't look at her as a daughter. He looked at her as a get-out-of jail-free card. Suddenly, the heavy iron doors at the far end of the warehouse groaned on their hinges. A low, rhythmic thudding, the sound of heavy boots on concrete, began to drown out the auctioneer's voice. The bidders turned, their hands moving instinctively to the holsters hidden beneath their coats. A silhouette stood framed against the moonlight of the open doorway, draped in a long, dark overcoat that seemed to swallow the light. There was no frantic shouting, no overt display of violence, just a cold, predatory silence that brought the entire room to a standstill. Hae-in looked up, her heart leaping into her throat as she recognized the sharp definition of a jawline and the silver hair that shimmered even in the gloom. As the figure stepped into the warehouse, a fleet of black luxury sedans screeched to a halt outside, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a hunting pack. The harmless boy from the desk was gone. In his place was a king who had finally decided to stop watching from the shadows. The warehouse air was thick with the scent of mildew and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Hae-in stood trembling on the makeshift auction block, the cold light of the overhead industrial lamps stripping away her dignity as her stepfather negotiated the final price of her life with Chairman Kang. The creditors circled her like sharks in suits, their eyes filled with a terrifying, transactional hunger. Just as the gavel of her fate was about to fall, the heavy iron doors of the warehouse didn't just open, they were torn from their hinges. The thunderous sound was followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. A phalanx of men in tailored black overcoats flooded the space, their movements synchronized with a lethal, military precision. At the center of the formation stood a figure who looked nothing like the harmless, sweater-clad student from the back of the classroom. Ji-hoon stepped into the harsh light, his silver hair shimmering like a blade. The thick glasses were gone, revealing eyes that held the cold, predatory depth of the Baek clan's thousand-year legacy. He wore a charcoal black suit that fit him like armor, a sharp contrast to the vulnerable girl he had watched over in silence for months. Behind him, the blurred reflection of a dozen black luxury sedans idled in the rain, their headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of a waiting beast. "Who the hell are you?" her stepfather stammered, his bravado crumbling as the high-ranking members of the Baek clan, the clan vanguard, took up positions around the perimeter. Ji-hoon didn't answer him. His gaze was fixed entirely on Hae-in, tracking the fresh bruise on her wrist with a quiet, terrifying menace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the high-end burner phone that had been vibrating all day, tossing it onto the table where the debt contracts lay. "I am the one who owns your debts," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, authoritative rasp that made the creditors recoil. "And I am the one who is finished playing the observer." Hae-in stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't her desk mate. This was the Baek King the city whispered about in fear. As he stepped toward the auction block, the air in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. The invisible nerd was gone, and in his place stood the heir to an empire, ready to dismantle everything that had ever caused her pain. The neon pulse of the nightclub flickered against the cold rain outside, but inside the VIP lounge, the air had turned to ice. Hae-in stood amidst the wreckage of her brother's failed deal, her eyes wide and fixed on the man she thought she knew. Ji-hoon no longer wore the oversized, protective sweater of a harmless student. He stood at the center of a 100-man army, his tailored black suit sharp enough to cut through the haze of the room. The heavy glasses were gone, revealing eyes that didn't just see the world. They commanded it. "Hae-in," he stepped forward, his voice dropping into that familiar, quiet tone, but the softness now felt like a velvet shroud over a blade. She recoiled as if his touch were a brand. The realization was a physical weight in her chest, heavier than any bruise her stepfamily had ever given her. For months, she had found solace at their shared desk, thinking she was protecting a kindred, gentle soul from the wolves of their school. She had shared her smallest fears with a nerd who was actually the architect of the very shadows she feared. "Was I just a project for you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a jagged, raw heartbreak. "A game to see how long you could play the savior before you got bored." Ji-hoon's hand faltered in midair, his intimidatingly calm facade cracking for the first time. He saw the look in her eyes, not the relief of being rescued, but the terror of being owned by a new master. He had dismantled her bullies' lives and bought their parents' companies to erase her tormentors, yet he had never once asked if she wanted to be part of his war. "I was protecting you," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "You weren't protecting me, Ji-hoon. You were managing me," she countered, her tears finally spilling over as she looked at the army of black-suited men standing at his back. "My stepfamily treated me like a product to be sold. You treated me like a bird you wanted to keep in a more expensive cage. You're just like them. You just have better clothes and a quieter way of lying." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ji-hoon looked at the red tears on the table and the scattered evidence of her family's greed, realizing his mistake. He had tried to provide a haven, but by keeping his power a secret, he had made her a victim twice over. He had removed her obstacles, but in doing so, he had stripped her of her own agency. Hae-in turned away from him, her heart shattering not from the cruelty of her enemies, but from the calculated kindness of her only friend. She walked toward the exit, her silhouette small against the overwhelming power of the Baek clan, leaving the king standing alone in his own dark empire. The cold, clinical air of the Baek ancestral estate felt like a sharp blade against the skin, a stark contrast to the humid, blood-scented rain of the city streets. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the vaulted hall, his silhouette cast in long, jagged shadows by the flickering candlelight. He had discarded the school blazer and the glasses that served as his mask, standing now in a tailored black suit that mirrored the dark, authoritative clothing of the men who surrounded him. Before him sat the elders of the Baek clan, their faces etched with the kind of ancient, remorseless power that didn't just command the underworld, but owned it. "You have been reckless, Ji-hoon," the high elder rasped, his voice echoing like dry parchment. You dismantled 3 subsidiary companies and liquidated a business partner's assets for the sake of a girl who possesses nothing but a notebook and a history of silence. Ji-hoon did not flinch. His presence remained intimidatingly calm, his eyes fixed on the patriarch with a predatory focus that even the elders found unsettling. He had spent months mapping the destruction of Hae-in's enemies, moving with a quiet menace that was now coming to its inevitable reckoning. Hae-in is not nothing, Ji-hoon replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration. She is the only thing in this city that isn't for sale. The elders exchanged looks of cold calculation. To them, Hae-in was a vulnerability, a softly lit distraction in a world that required high-contrast lethality. They saw the bruise Ji-hoon had discovered on her wrist, not as a reason for justice, but as a symptom of a weakness he could no longer afford to harbor. The Baek clan does not tolerate a king who serves a servant, the elder continued. You have used our vanguard and our reach to play the role of a guardian angel. Now the bill is due. You must choose. The inheritance of the clan, the throne we have built through generations of blood, or the girl. The silence that followed was heavy, atmospheric, and thick with the scent of old wood and impending violence. Outside the high windows, the blurred reflections of black luxury cars sat idling, their headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of waiting wolves. Ji-hoon felt the weight of his destiny pressing down on him, the same power that had allowed him to begin the audit and systematically ruin the lives of those who hurt Hae-in. If I choose her, Ji-hoon said. His words measured and slow. I walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. You walk away a ghost, the elder confirmed. No protection, no name, no power, you will be as vulnerable as she is. Ji-hoon thought of the classroom, of the way Hae-in hunched over her work despite the malice surrounding her. He realized then that his secret protection had been a second prison, a cage of his own making that she never asked to enter. Then take the throne, Ji-hoon said, reaching into his pocket and dropping his high-end burner phone onto the stone floor. I'd rather be a ghost beside her than a king in an empty hall. As he turned to leave, the elders didn't move to stop him. They simply watched as their heir chose the girl over the empire, unaware that by nightfall, the fire Ji-hoon had started would burn everything they had ever built. The sun rose over the prestigious academy, but for the group known as the Royals, the light brought only cold, clinical devastation. They had arrived at school expecting another day of undisputed reign, but the world they sat atop had been hollowed out while they slept. It began with a synchronized series of vibrating phones and frantic whispers that rippled through the hallways like a shockwave. Min-ho, the leader of the pack, stood frozen by the lockers as he watched his father, a man whose wealth had once felt like an impenetrable fortress, being escorted from their family estate on the morning news, his assets frozen and his reputation incinerated by a sudden, systemic audit. One by one, the other bullies felt their anchors snap. Families who had once held the city's boardrooms were suddenly destitute, their companies bought out, and their parents fired in a ruthless, silent acquisition orchestrated by an invisible hand. The power they had used as a bludgeon against Yoon Hae-in was gone, replaced by a vacuum of terrified anonymity. Inside the classroom, the atmosphere was thick with a new, heavy silence. Hae-in sat at her usual desk, softly lit by the morning sun, focused on her notebook as if the world weren't ending around her. Beside her sat Ji-hoon. He remained intimidatingly calm, the silver of his hair catching the light while a slight shadow lingered across his eyes behind his glasses. He looked exactly like the Harmless desk mate they had mocked for months, yet the predatory stillness radiating from him was now unmistakable. The Royals, once loud and chaotic, were now ghosts in their own hallways. They looked at Ji-hoon and finally saw the Baek King they had heard whispered about in the shadows of the underworld. They realized that every time they had doused Hae-in's desk in ink or left a bruise on her wrist, they had been signing a warrant for their own destruction. Ji-hoon didn't need to raise a hand or a voice. The blurred reflection of the black luxury cars idling at the school gate told the entire story of his reign. By the time the lunch bell rang, the hierarchy was dismantled. The students who had once lived to torment Hae-in now moved through the corridors with their heads bowed, terrified that even a stray glance toward her desk would result in the final erasure of their names. They were no longer the elite. They were the casualties of a war they hadn't even known they were fighting. Hae-in looked up from her work, sensing the shift in the air, and for the first time, the malice that had always surrounded her was replaced by a profound, trembling respect. Ji-hoon simply adjusted his sleeve, his dark clothing a sharp contrast to the fading light of the royal's former glory, as he prepared to stand beside her in a world he had cleared of her enemies. The air in the Park family's basement was thick with the scent of damp concrete and the metallic tang of old fear. Ji-hoon moved through the shadows with the clinical detachment of an apex predator, his tailored black suit a stark contrast to the filth of the underground room. He didn't need his glasses here. The darkness was his natural habitat, and his eyes, sharp and predatory, missed nothing. In a rusted locker tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten moving blankets, Ji-hoon found it. A small, unassuming digital recorder and a series of memory cards meticulously labeled by her stepfather. As he thumbed the device to life, the suffocating silence of the basement was shattered by the sound of Hae-in's voice, thin, trembling, and laced with a quiet, desperate endurance. He heard the heavy thud of a strike, the sharp intake of her breath, and the cold, transactional tone of her stepfather discussing her sale to pay off his gambling debts. Every rhythmic click of the playback felt like a physical blow to Ji-hoon's chest. The justice at any cost fire that usually sustained him was replaced by a cold, jagged spike of absolute fury. He listened to Hae-in pleading not for her own safety, but for the sake of the quiet life she had tried to build at her school desk. His grip tightened on the recorder until the plastic casing groaned under his strength. The audit he had started, the systematic dismantling of the stepfamily's financial life, now felt insufficient. This wasn't just a business matter for the Baek clan. This was a desecration of the girl who had once tried to protect him from the world's shadows. Ji-hoon looked at the recordings, the digital glow reflecting in his dark eyes. This was the evidence that would ensure the Park family didn't just fall, but were erased from the social fabric of the city. He reached for his burner phone, the screen illuminating his face in a harsh blue light. "Clan Vanguard," he said, his voice a flat, lethal rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. "The audit is closed. Move to the Nightfall reckoning. I want them to see the face of the man who owns their debt before I break them." He tucked the memory cards into his inner pocket, his heart rate remaining a steady, rhythmic pulse even as he prepared to turn the city into a slaughterhouse. The harmless nerd was gone. Only the heir remained, and by nightfall, the people who had recorded Hae-in's suffering would realize they had just signed their own death warrants. The cold rain fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, washing over the grime of the narrow alleyway behind the warehouse. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. At the mouth of the alley, a row of black luxury sedans stood like silent sentinels, their idling engines a low, predatory hum that vibrated through the pavement. The headlights cut through the downpour, casting long, jagged shadows against the brick walls and illuminating the man trembling in the center of the light. Chairman Kang, the man who had treated Hae-in, life as a line item on a ledger, looked nothing like the untouchable titan of industry he had been hours ago. His expensive silk suit was soaked through, clinging to his frame as he stumbled back, his eyes darting frantically toward the dark silhouettes of the Baek clan guards blocking every exit. Ji-hoon stepped forward, his movements fluid and precise. He had long since discarded the school blazer and the heavy glasses that had served as his mask. Clad in an authoritative black overcoat, his silver hair dampened by the storm, he looked every bit the Mafia heir he was born to be. The soft-spoken nerd from the desk beside Hae-in was gone, replaced by a man whose gaze held the absolute weight of a death sentence. "You thought she was a commodity," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, lethal rasp that carried easily over the sound of the rain. "You thought because she was quiet, she was alone." He didn't need to raise his hand. Two guards stepped into the light, their presence forcing Kang to his feet before a sharp kick to the back of his knees brought him crashing down. The sound of his bones hitting the wet stone echoed through the alley. Kang gasped, his hands clawing at the slick ground as he looked up in terror. I I didn't know, he stammered, his teeth chattering from the cold and the sheer adrenaline of panic. The step-family, they said she was a nobody. She is everything, Ji-hoon replied, stopping just inches from the kneeling man. He leaned down, the shadows stretching across his face, his expression one of terrifying, frozen calm. And you are finished. From the darkness behind Ji-hoon, Hae-in emerged. She walked slowly, her shoulders no longer hunched in the vulnerable slouch of the classroom. The rain matted her hair, but her eyes were fixed on the man who had tried to buy her freedom. Ji-hoon didn't speak. He simply stepped aside, offering her the center of the light. The power in the alley had shifted. The predatory silence of the Baek clan served as a shroud for her as she looked down at her tormentor. In this rain-slicked tomb of his reputation, Chairman Kang realized that the nobody he had sought to crush was the only person who could grant him mercy, and Ji-hoon was merely the weapon she now held. The cold, persistent rain lashed against the windows of the Baek clan's private estate, mirroring the storm that had finally broken over the city. Inside the mahogany-walled study, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. Ji-hoon stood at the center of the room, the sharp definition of his face no longer hidden by glasses, his dark clothing damp from the night's work. Across from him sat the executors of the Park estate, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they laid out the heavy, ink-stained folders of the debt contract. For years, these papers had been Hae-in's cage, a legal shackle that allowed her stepfamily to treat her as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Ji-hoon didn't look at the lawyers. His gaze was fixed on Hae-in, who stood by the door, framed by the dim, cinematic lighting. She looked fragile, her shoulders slightly rounded as she watched the life she had known being dismantled on a desk. The total outstanding debt, including interest and the transfer fee set by the stepfather, comes to 15 billion won, the lead lawyer stammered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Ji-hoon didn't blink. He reached into his coat and produced a single, high-end burner phone, the same one that had vibrated with Clan Vanguard, alerts throughout the day. With a few precise taps, he signaled the finalization of the audit, the silent retribution that had already erased the financial lifelines of her tormentors. The transfer is complete, Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, authoritative rasp that carried the weight of his hidden mafia power. The Park family no longer exists in the ledger of this city. Their assets have been liquidated. Their name is ash. He picked up the original contract, the physical manifestation of the stepfather's debt. For a moment, the room felt the predatory silence that had once defined their classroom desk. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Ji-hoon tore the heavy parchment down the middle. The sound of the thick paper rending was the only noise in the room, more explosive than any gunshot. He dropped the fragments onto the floor, where they scattered like autumn leaves in a graveyard. Hae-in gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The shackle was gone. The sail that had loomed over her like a death sentence had been neutralized by the very man she had once tried to protect from the world. Ji-hoon stepped toward her, his presence no longer a harmless facade, but a shield of cold, blue-gray steel. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood as an ally, waiting for her to realize that she was no longer a prisoner of her bloodline. "You aren't a debt to be paid anymore, Hae-in," he whispered, the quiet menace of his voice softening just for her. "You are yours. No one else has a claim." Hae-in looked at the torn papers, then back at the heir of the Baek clan. The freedom was dizzying, a bitter and sweet realization that while the cage was gone, the man who broke it was a stranger she was only beginning to truly see. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic, mournful tap against the window of the empty classroom, echoing the hollow ache in Hae-in's chest. She sat at her desk, the same wood where she had spent months as a living ghost, but the air around her had changed. The ink stains from the bullies were gone, scrubbed away by hands she now knew were capable of ending lives with a single gesture. Beside her, the seat once occupied by the harmless nerd felt like a gaping wound in the room's silence. Hae-in ran her thumb over the edge of her notebook, her movements no longer frantic or trembling. The stepfamily that had viewed her as a blood bag was gone, erased from the city's social fabric by Ji-hoon's calculated audit. She was legally free, her debts bought and torn into confetti, yet the weight of that freedom felt heavier than the chains of her old life. The realization that her sanctuary had been a second prison, built of secrets and surveillance, left a bitter taste in her mouth that no amount of safety could sweeten. Ji-hoon stood by the door, his shadow long and authoritative against the cold blue-gray tones of the hallway. He had discarded the thick glasses and the oversized sweaters, standing now in the sharp definition of his true self, the Baek clan heir. He didn't speak. He simply watched her with a restrained, predatory stillness that no longer felt like a shield, but like a cage. "I can't stay here, Ji-hoon," she whispered, her voice steady despite the melancholic chill of the room. "You have everything now," he replied, his tone quiet and cinematic. "The house is yours. The Park family can never touch you again. You are the most protected person in this city." Hae-in finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the vulnerability of a woman who had realized her savior was just another master with a kinder face. "That's the problem. I've spent my whole life being protected or prepared for someone else's business. I don't even know what I look like when I'm not standing in your shadow." She stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a harshness that broke the atmospheric tension. She didn't take the burner phone he offered, nor did she look toward the black luxury cars idling at the gate. She needed the silence of a life where no one was mapping her tactical placements or monitoring her heart rate. As she walked past him, the scent of expensive cologne and gun oil faded, replaced by the damp, honest smell of the rain. Ji-hoon reached out as if to stop her, but his hand faltered, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. He was the king of the underworld, but he could not command a heart that needed to heal in the dark, away from the glare of his power. Hae-in stepped out into the night alone, the bitter cold of freedom stinging her cheeks. It was a slow-burn departure, one that left the Baek heir standing in the ruins of his own protection. For the first time in her life, the path ahead of her was unlit and unmonitored, and though she was afraid, she walked into the shadows by her own choice. The heavy silence of the classroom had become a different kind of vacuum, one that no longer hummed with the threat of bullies, but with the crushing weight of a singular absence. Ji-hoon sat at the same scarred wooden desk, his frame casting a long, dark shadow against the floor. He wore the school blazer again, the authoritative black clothing of the Baek clan hidden beneath the facade of a student, yet he no longer wore the glasses that once served as his mask. His eyes, sharp and weary, remained fixed on the empty seat beside him, tracing the ghost of Hae-in's presence in the grain of the wood. Outside the window, the blue-gray tones of the late afternoon sky signaled the approach of another nightfall, and the blurred reflections of black luxury cars remained idling at the gate, their engines a low, subservient growl. His subordinates waited for a king who refused to move. The high-end burner phone in his pocket remained silent. The clan vanguard had learned that their young master would not answer any call that did not bring news of her. Every day followed the same agonizing rhythm. He would arrive before the first light touched the chalkboard and remain long after the janitors had finished their rounds. He sat in a state of quiet menace, a predatory stillness that kept the rest of the student body at a terrified distance. They knew now that the harmless nerd was the heir to an empire, but Ji-hoon felt less like a ruler and more like a prisoner of his own making. He had torn the world down to give her freedom, but in doing so, he had realized the bitter truth of his own flaw. His protection had been a cage, and his secrecy a betrayal. He reached out, his fingers brushing the spot where she used to hunch over her notebook, vulnerable and unaware of the war he was waging in her name. He had won the battle against her stepfamily and crushed the royals into the mud, but he was losing the war for her heart. This was his submission, not to the elders of the Baek clan or to the laws of the underworld, but to the silence she had left behind. He was a king waiting at a desk, stripped of his arrogance, hopping only for the moment she might walk through the door, not because she was forced, but because she chose to stand beside him as an equal. The heavy iron gates of the school, which once felt like the bars of a cold, indifferent cage, swung open with a silent, oiled precision. Hae-in stepped onto the pavement, the morning sun catching the sharp lines of her new blazer. She no longer walked with her head bowed or her shoulders rounded in a submissive slouch to mask her presence. Instead, she sat tall, her gaze fixed forward with the clarity of someone who had survived a dance of death and emerged with her soul intact. The atmosphere in the hallway shifted the moment she entered. The royals, who had once filled these corridors with chaotic noise and malice, now stood frozen against the lockers. Their faces were pale, their eyes tracking her with a terror that bordered on reverence. They remembered the Nightfall reckoning, the sight of their parents' empires collapsing, and the cold, rain-slicked alley where they were forced to kneel in the mud. The hierarchy had not just shifted, it had been dismantled and rebuilt in her image. Hae-in reached her old desk, the wood still bearing the faint, scrubbed stains of the ink from weeks ago. She didn't flinch at the memory. Beside her, the seat was occupied by a figure who no longer wore the harmless nerd mask. Ji-hoon sat with his silver hair catching the light, his thick glasses discarded to reveal eyes that held an open, unwavering respect. He didn't loom over her as a master or a protector, but sat as an equal in the black site they now called a classroom. "You're late," Ji-hoon murmured, his voice no longer a flat, lethal rasp, but something warmer, grounded in the reality they had chosen together. Hae-in set her notebook down with a steady hand. "I took the long way. I wanted to see the city without the shadows." He nodded, a microscopic movement of acknowledgement. Outside the window, the fleet of black luxury cars was gone, replaced by the mundane rhythm of a world that had moved on. The invisible war was over, and the ghost warden of her past had been laid to rest. She was no longer a blood bag or a canary in a woven cage. She was an eagle who had finally found her wings. As the teacher began the lesson, the room remained thick with a new kind of silence, not the suffocating tension of quiet menace, but the profound stillness of a peace won through fire. Hae-in opened her book, her posture regal and her spirit unburdened. The girl who believed endurance was survival had been replaced by a woman who knew that true power was the freedom to choose her own path. Beside her, the Mafia heir who had once manipulated the dark to save her simply watched her work, content to be the ally she had demanded. In this new hierarchy, there were no puppets, only survivors who had learned to stand tall amidst the ruins of their old lives. The heavy, iron-bound doors of the gilded hall remained sealed, but the air inside had finally cleared of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Sunlight, pale and cold, filtered through the high, shattered windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced over the wreckage of the Lombardy and Shen legacies. In the center of the quiet ruin, the mahogany table had been wiped clean of spilled cognac and tactical gear, restored to a state of deceptive simplicity. Hae-in sat at the desk, her posture no longer a submissive slouch designed to deflect the eyes of predators. She sat tall, her shoulders square and her gaze fixed on the horizon of a city that no longer held her in a cage. The living ghost had vanished, replaced by a woman who had seen the world burn and realized she was the one holding the match. Beside her, the seat was no longer occupied by a harmless nerd hiding behind thick, glare-heavy lenses. Ji-hoon sat next to her, his heavy sweaters and the mask of the obedient classmate discarded in the rubble of the warehouse. Without the glasses, his eyes were sharp, dark, and filled with a terrifyingly clear focus. He didn't look at her as a protector guarding a vulnerable asset, nor did he look at her as a project to be managed. He simply sat, his hands resting flat on the table, steady, powerful, and still. The silence between them was no longer the quiet menace of a predator waiting for the kill, nor was it the suffocating silence of a victim waiting for the blow. It was the silence of an absolute understanding. Outside, the fleet of black luxury cars still idled, but their engines were quieted, their drivers waiting for a signal that would only come when these two were ready. The Baek clan and the ruins of the Shen Empire were merely pieces on a board they had both decided to stop playing. Ji-hoon reached out, not to pick up a dropped pen or to guide her toward a safe place, but to simply place his hand near hers on the polished wood. Hae-in didn't flinch. She turned her hand over, her fingers brushing against his, acknowledging the strength he had used to dismantle her enemies and the restraint he had learned to grant her freedom. They were no longer the invisible duo of a high school classroom or the heir and the victim of an underworld war. The hierarchy had been leveled. In the hollowed-out remains of the hall, among the dust of broken diamonds and fallen kings, they were finally equals. The masks were gone, the glasses were broken, and the world they now owned waited for them to breathe. When the Harmless desk mate finally takes off his glasses, the entire city falls into shadow. If you're ready to watch Hae-in rise from the ruins and see Ji-hoon dismantle every royal who dared to touch her, then subscribe and like to join the Baek clan. Share this reckoning with those who love justice and turn on post notifications. Nightfall is coming, and you won't want to be in the dark for the next powerful chapter.